Good morning, everybody. My name is Joe Dunn. I'm the director of the European Parliament Office, the European Parliament Liaison Office in Washington, D.C. Very happy to be a co-sponsor of this event with American University. The office was set up 10 years ago for encouraging relations and fostering contacts between the European Parliament and the United States Congress. And at the same time, we also do quite a lot of outreach with the 2.7 million Europeans who live, the foreign residents who live in the United States, and working with universities like American University, like the Transatlantic Policy Center. And this event blends both of these functions that we have, and it comes, I think, at a very important time. It's a very timely event, looking at the social and economic, racial impacts of 2020, of the pandemic, and what has been happening. We're living, I think, a tipping point for change, a typical time where we need to work together, including across the Atlantic. I read in the Financial Times at the weekend that most of the problems we face are problems that require international cooperation, and so they probably won't be tackled. So I think it's our duty to make sure that this is not true, and that parliamentarians working together and using the resources of universities and students and citizens, that we set about building back better, as the current phrase goes, reconstructing and rethinking justice in our time. So thank you. Over to you, Lia, and I'm looking forward to a very interesting and stimulating event.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you to everyone for joining us. It is an honor for me to help to kick off this very important discussion on reconstructing and rethinking social and racial justice post-COVID-19. I am a professor at American University's Washington College of Law, but I would also, in addition to the Washington College of Law, like to mention the co-sponsors of this event that come from the other parts of the university. And those are the School of International Service, the Transatlantic Policy Center, the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, and of course, the European Parliament Liaison Office in Washington. Just a few tips for how the discussion will go forward. It will last for approximately 45 minutes, including a question and answer with the audience. If you wish to ask a question at any time, please do submit it through the question and answer function at the bottom of the Zoom window. Answers to the questions will not be typed into the Q&A function, but the closed captions will include all responses. We also ask that no one record this session. We will be recording the webinar, and it will be available on the School of International Service YouTube channel for those who would like to watch it again, or for anyone who may have missed the event. So at this time, it is my honor to introduce the panelists for this very important discussion. We are joined today by Member of European Parliament, Dr. Pierrette Herzberger-Fofana. She is a co-president of the European Parliament Intergroup on Anti-Racism and Diversity. She is vice chair of the European Parliament's Committee on Development and a substitute member to the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. Her areas of focus are international partnerships,
It seems we may have lost Lia. Professor Martin, would you like to jump in and perhaps do these introductions? Is that okay?
Yes, terribly sorry. This is the world we live in, where we're incumbent on Zoom internet connections, and they are always liable to fall down any given moment. So I am Garrett Martin. I'm a professor at the School of International Service and the co-director of the Transatlantic Policy Center, one of the co-sponsors. I'm hoping that my colleague, Professor Epperson, will be able to rejoin us, and I will hide again if that happens. But as she was starting to introduce one of our first panelists, Dr. Pierrette Herzberger-Fofana, one of our MEP guests. We also have amongst our guests and panelists, Congressman Jamie Raskin, who is the US representative for Maryland's 8th District and was also a professor of constitutional law for more than a quarter century at American University's Washington College of Law. Welcome, Congressman Raskin. And finally, we also have MEP Maria Walsh, who is a Fine Gael member of the European Parliament for Ireland since 2019. And also, interestingly, MEP Walsh's story very much straddles both sides of the Atlantic, as she was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and lived in the United States for many years. And so we're very delighted to have all of you here today. I may go ahead and ask the first question just in case, but rapidly eclipse if we're able to welcome back our moderator. So first of all, of course, as Joe Dunn mentioned, of course, the summer of 2020 has been an extraordinary time for the United States for many reasons. If we look at the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, to mention a few, and all of those terrible incidents have really catapulted to many Americans of all race and ages and backgrounds this question. And we also saw the way that the Black Lives Matter was now fully enmeshed into the political dynamics and discourse of the United States. And interestingly as well, in the summer, we also saw how protests also emerged in multiple countries across the European Union, chanting the names of those fellow citizens who have suffered from discrimination or police violence. For instance, the name of Adama Traore, a young Black European man of Malian descent, who died after being arrested by Paris police. And so I think today we're very honored and very lucky to have the three of you and three panelists to really focus on these important social and racial justice questions within a transatlantic framework. So the first question I would like to ask to all three of you is as follows. What was your reaction to the Black Lives Matter protests that emerged in the United States and in Europe this past summer? And how would you assess the levels of racism and discrimination in the United States or the European Union today? Let me maybe ask Congressman Raskin to kick us off, since the protest really surfaced first in the United States before really moving to the other side of the Atlantic as well.
Professor Martin, thank you so much for having me, and also to my colleague, Professor Lia Epperson, when she returns from Zoom oblivion. I want to thank her for her leadership here, and I'm delighted to be with my fellow parliamentarians from around the world. It's very exciting to be with you both. And Maria Walsh, I can't wait to hear whether you've got a Boston accent or an Irish accent. I'm just dying to hear that. But look, Black Lives Matter to me was a sensational breakthrough moment for American political culture, and also in all candor, if I can speak freely here, in terms of an answer to Donald Trump and Trumpism, because I think that in truth that we've been wrestling for ways to deal with the problem of Trump, and Black Lives Matter, which didn't really take him on directly, was the best, the most sweeping and comprehensive refutation of Trumpism, because what it identified was that really what made our slide into quasi-authoritarianism and our slide onto the road of being a failed state possible was the underlying racism. And Trump and Trump's people kept talking about the search for the deep state. Well, Black Lives Matter found the deep state in our country. The deep state in America is white supremacy, political white supremacy, and racism. And so we have been on the road to a failed state. A failed state, of course, is one that cannot deliver the basic goods of existence to its people, like security against disease. Here we are, the richest country on earth with some of the greatest doctors and scientists, and yet we lead the world in COVID-19 infections. We lead the world in COVID-19 deaths. We lead the world in COVID-19 propaganda and disinformation. Security, freedom from random gun violence. Again, America just totally off the charts in terms of the levels of gun violence, and the opportunity for people to be in church or at a synagogue or a mosque or a Walmart or a gay nightclub and have somebody show up with a military-style assault weapon and just start shooting everybody down. We are in a class by ourselves there. So Black Lives Matter identified the fact that the social contract is not functioning, because another principal element of the social contract is that we will be safer inside of it than we will be outside of it. If you go back and you read John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and Rousseau and everybody, the whole idea is that you trade your freedom of violent self-defense for participation in a social covenant where you'll be safer. And yet, for African Americans and members of other racial minority groups, that social contract does not function in many parts of the country, where the implicit bargain has been that the police can do whatever they want to you. And so Black Lives Matter has put the whole question of the nature of our broken and increasingly dysfunctional social contract on the table. And so I think that it has also helped to clarify and articulate our politics. Unfortunately, we still remain a deeply divided and polarized society. Now, fortunately, we are able to withstand all of the efforts to deprive us of a real election. We had a real election. Joe Biden won by more than 5 million votes. We're hanging tough and defending the Electoral College majority against attacks, political and juridical. But there were still 70 million people who voted for the party that is not an openly racist party, but certainly indulges and tolerates racism. The good news on the other side is the other party, the majority party, is an anti-racist party. So we have an anti-racist party, and then we've got a party that gives a wink and a nod. I mean, over the weekend, I was down on the Hill welcoming the new members of Congress, and the Trump holdout people marched, tens of thousands of them, in support of Donald Trump's delusions that the election's not over or that he won the election. And mixed in now, without any comment at all, is Proud Boys and other openly racist elements of the right-wing coalition. And they don't even feel the need to disavow their incorporation, the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys and the other white supremacist elements, which of course Donald Trump has been stoking and pandering to ever since he came into office. So I would say that we have not dealt with our historic problem yet, the original sin of the country, at all. We are in need desperately of a third Reconstruction in America, a movement for interracial social progress at every level, federal, state, and local. We need to remake the policing function. That was the purpose of our George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which I can discuss later if anybody's interested in the elements of it. So we have to do what our forebears did after the Civil War for a 12-year period before that was dismantled by white supremacy, and what our predecessors did in the Civil Rights Movement in getting past the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65. But large parts of the country, and unfortunately the Supreme Court, have retreated to the baseline of conservative white supremacy on the side of class power. And that is going to be the political struggle of our time. I mean, the good news is that we don't have a completely deranged person at the top of the government, and the executive branch of the government will be on our side. But the struggle will continue, and it's a big one. And in some sense, I mean, we have the experience of all of the prior civil rights movements to go upon: the civil rights movement and the women's movement and the LGBTQ movement and the labor movement, the environmental movement, the civilizing movements of the last century. On the other hand, the stakes are even higher, because in the vernacular of the racists, they see what's happening is that America is on the precipice of not being a majority white country anymore. And so they view this really as a, as a final political death match to save the historic white supremacy. So racism does remain alive and well as a beating political force in our country. I will yield back to you guys.
Thank you so much, Jamie, Congressman Raskin. And so well said, the how we deal with the original sin here in the United States and what we can hope for in terms of an anti-racist future. I'd like to ask the similar question with respect to the state of affairs in the European Union to Dr. Pierrette Herzberger-Fofana, who I believe I may have been cut off in introducing, so I wanted to just say once more that she is a co-president of the European Parliament Intergroup on Anti-Racism and Diversity, vice chair of the European Parliament's Committee on Development, and a substitute member to the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality, focusing on international partnerships, gender-based violence, and anti-racism. So, Dr. Herzberger-Fofana, for you and your experience in Europe, what was your reaction to Black Lives Matter, to the protests, to the level of discrimination that you see? I know that you both work on this on a professional level and that you have had your own personal experiences with this. So whatever you would like to share.
I think she's muted.
So you can hear me now? Is it okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me today and for organizing this important exchange. Unfortunately, I will have to leave earlier, but I welcome anyone to send their question or ideas to my official office via email. My reaction to the Black Lives Matter protest happened on several levels, one could say. The first is within my parliamentary work, it was a political momentum to push the fight for social justice and to highlight anti-Black racism within the EU. The death of George Floyd moved me to write a letter to the European Commission calling for active action against racism. I also asked for two essential measures. Firstly, to introduce an anti-racism coordinator, and secondly, to hold an anti-racism summit with the Commission President and representatives of civil society. 102 of my colleagues signed this letter. In fact, President Ursula von der Leyen granted both demands. The anti-racism coordinator will probably be named this year, and I hope and I insist that this person comes from a visible minority. A few weeks later, I suggested to my MP colleagues to nominate the three founders of Black Lives Matter for the Sakharov Prize of the European Parliament, but I haven't succeeded. So, another level, let us say with regard to the Black community in Germany and other European countries, a new dynamic evolved. For the first time at the protests, at least in Germany, many white people also demonstrated and started to take their responsibility in the fight against structural racism. If we want to look at the level of racism in the EU and the US respectively, one can draw many comparisons. However, I would distinguish the historic backgrounds and their effects on the relations between the mainstream and marginalized group in the society. Where I see the difference, a difference between Europe and the US is their distinct historic links to the current Black communities within the countries. During the protest in the US, many statues of former politicians that enabled or promoted slave trade were demolished. In Europe, it was most personalities linked to colonial exploitation. Just to name an example, in Belgium, for example. What is similar are oftentimes the symptom that hints towards social injustice. If we consider can you see me? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, but I don't see you, but doesn't matter.
We see you.
Okay,
we
that's
see
okay.
you.
So what is similar are oftentimes the symptoms that hint towards social injustice. If we consider the situation of people of African descent, Black people in Europe or the US, we can name the areas of housing, the job market, access to health and legal assistance as those where discrimination has tangible negative effects. Unfortunately, the most visible similarity seems to be physical racist attacks and police violence against Black people and other minorities. After the death of George Floyd, many European governments looked towards the US, and it were the Black grassroots organizations who demanded them to orient their attention back to EU member states where similar situations occur regularly. In Germany, we know the names of victims like Uri Jallo, who burned to death in custody handcuffed, Christy Schwundeck or Lai Alamakonde, or the shocking case of Tono Mbopta, a young man who actually sought health in a psychiatric facility and was killed by security guard. The case was later dropped due to lack of evidence. If we look further to France, we see the so-called Affaire Théo, a young Black man who was held on the ground by several police officers and raped with a baton, all of which was filmed. Or we remember to Adama Traoré, a young man who died in police custody. Here in Belgium, there are also cases where violence is done to Black people. A young Afro-Belgian student, Sandadia, paid for this with his life at his university. Even the New York Times reported on it. During a membership test for a fraternity, he was particularly harassed for racist motives and later died of the consequences. Those responsible, in turn, quietly completed their degree and even held position as research assistants. When they were finally accused, the trial had to be organized in another city because one of the perpetrators is the judge's son. There have many protests by Black and white students who demand consequences for this behavior, but the university itself. So I would say we are sadly linked with this experience of structural and direct violence Black people have to face in the US as well in Europe. My hope is that the visibility the fight for Black lives has now, and which is unprecedented, will contribute to helping our societies face their history and identify the root causes for our current injustice. I don't see. Can you see me?
Yes, yes, we see you.
Professor Epperson, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes, yes.
Do you mind if I jump in there just because?
Please do, please do.
And Congressman Raskin, I really apologize. My Bostonian tones were lost a little bit, but hopefully you'll hear some. I lived for many years in Philadelphia, so my heart kind of got left in the city of brotherly love more than Boston, but don't tell my family that. But just to jump in, first and foremost, I want to acknowledge Professor Martin, who through the trials and tribulations of us trying to connect, jumped in at the last moment. So while I'm all about supporting the sisterhood, sometimes we have to shed the hand to our male counterparts too. So
absolutely.
well done, Gary. Plus he has an Irish name, so it'd be ignorant of me not to do that. But just in terms of that question, it's such a valid question, and a question that didn't and shouldn't just stop once our president-elect, who I'm delighted is showing and was announced. Pity about the current situation we have at hand, but change is coming. But when you look at that, the question that you'd asked, it's a case of it doesn't the systematic change isn't affected in just the United States, as both panelists had shared. It is waves, and it created waves of change. And dare I say, it was a catalyst for when President Trump got in 2016. I think a lot of people right throughout the world looked closely at themselves and their communities and families, and those that were comfortable to have the conversation around xenophobia, homophobia, racism did so, and the rest of us were quite slow to it until we saw what had happened in the murder of George Floyd, and then umpteen amount of lives lost over generations, not just in 2020. The question was around what change have we seen? I also think it's really important for listeners, and delighted to see so many on the call, that for me, I look at this in a twofold way, personal and professional, because if we're expecting the world to change outside, we have a hell of a lot more work to do internally to make sure our dialogue is correct when we go out and face the world. And I say that as a young LGBTQI woman. I say that as a young elected woman in the European Parliament who is as divided as the United States right now too. From a personal level, I had great conversation with friends and really just trying to learn the language and understanding of, well, where's my blind spots? Where's my unconscious bias? Where's my assumptions that everybody is at the table? And where is my understanding that we don't have equal voices at the table yet? And what the hell do I need to do in order to change that? And that's from the personal side. And then from the professional side, just because I know us politicians love some statistics and numbers, I do want to reassure any Americans watching again that the European Union doesn't have this solved either. We have only white commissioners. We have 12 of the 27 member states who have ethnic minority MEPs. We have 15 of the 27 member states who have dedicated action plans and strategies to combat racism and ethnic discrimination. So we've a long way to go in order to balance what is need to be balanced here. And just in terms of our own numbers, you know, I was startled on the first day of school, I should say, in the European Parliament when we were being officially announced into the hemicycle in Strasbourg, and the fact that where are our communities? You know, and I say that as a privileged white woman who happens to be gay, who happens to be from a rural part of Ireland, and who has many other links to her name, but if 10% of the European Union is made up of ethnic and racial minorities, why aren't they represented in our politics? And that is where we as politicians need to start. I believe we need to start looking at making sure not just our policy and legislation changes, but so too does the DNA of our teams. So again, that we don't end up with just all white people who look like us, who sound like us, who think like us, because we know, and I hate to use the United States as a scapegoat here, when you surround people who look and talk and think like you end up with what we currently have as the President of the United States, Donald Trump. And that we are too good for right across the world. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Lia.
Oh, thank you so much, Maria. Well said. And it touches on so many things in the United States because, as Jamie said, we are increasingly multicultural here and increasingly racially segregated. But you mentioned the importance of learning from one another. And I know that Pierrette is leaving us shortly, but I wondered if I could ask one more question of her related to what you said, Maria, because Pierrette, you are a former high school teacher. And I wonder what role you think education, particularly in the fields of history and citizenship, may play in countering racism, in countering discrimination.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'm sorry. Okay. So as a former teacher, if we look at Europe, for instance, to include a colonial history in history lesson, which is to this day not the standard. For example, in Germany is not Nobody knows, for example. If you do not learn anything, for example, about the genocide of the Nama and Iriwa in Namibia by German colonial powers in the subject of history, it is also difficult to comprehensively understand a social and German racism problem. For example, African history is not taught at the school, even at the high level, like at the end of the last class at the high school. Nobody knows anything, although very, very little. It can also mean to understand who different groups live German reality. I always name the example of Black people and Afro-Germans, for example, during the Third Reich under Hitler. And at an event I organized within the context of the UN Decade of People of African Descent in my hometown during the Black History, an event, and for the first time I had a very big exchange and with 3 Afro-Germans who have been in concentration camps. So it's something that nobody knows. When you say there have been Black German in concentration camps, the first reaction is to say no, because on the law, it was not written that the German Nazi law are against Black, or nobody wants to know that, to understand that. So it was, although when I made this big event in my hometown, it was the first time that the 3 of them met, and it was very moving and impressive evening for everyone present. Unfortunately, 2 of them died. One a year after, 2016, and it was with 14 years old. It was 14 years old. He came in Buchenwald, and was 2 years there. The other one was not in concentration camp, but it was in a work camp, and considered as a foreigner. Theodor Michael, and Theodor Michael was born, all of them were born in Germany from a white mother. Gertschheim, his father was American, and Theodor Michael, his father was from Cameroon, and Marie Neza was the only woman who Goebbels, it was the propaganda ministry at the time of Hitler, who took her out of the school to play the racist film, the Nazi make at that time. These are just examples of shared history that needs to become visible in order to complement and complete Eurocentric interpretation of our shared past. With my students, I always made a point to communicate the riches and the richness of the Francophone West African literature, because I make my PhD on the African Francophone women literature, that's why, or of the work of Mandela, for example, and we made a big ceremony when he died, which is very, very moved, because the student, Muslim student, Jews and Christian pray for that. And it was, I am sure, the first time that in Germany, in a public school, we had something like that. So I believe mainstreaming this type of knowledge can generate a great change, a really, really great change in our history and in our society.
Thank you very much. And a very important reminder of what power comes with knowledge and with expanding knowledge for all. I wonder if I could turn it back to you, Jamie, for a moment to think about this education in the context of law, as we are both constitutional lawyers, and you for over a quarter century constitutional law professor, so you are that voice on the Hill. What might you see as perhaps the most urgent avenues for dismantling racist structures, either just in terms of legal remedies or criminal justice remedies in the United States, and even if you see opportunities for European lawmakers as well.
So the House of Representatives passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which was the most comprehensive and sweeping police reform legislation in American history. And as Americans will know, but not necessarily everybody else, we have a tremendously decentralized system with state and local control over most of the policing function. And that has allowed for very uneven development along equal protection norms in our society. So our bill deals with a lot of that. For example, it mandates the use of body cameras and dashboard cameras for all police citizen encounters. It establishes the principle that any local police department that gets aid from the federal government must adopt a principle that there's no use of lethal force except to save someone's life. So it's only to repel lethal force that you use lethal force. You don't put your knee on someone's neck when they're handcuffed. There are a number of other, important parts to it. There's the creation of a nationwide database of disciplined and prosecuted cops, so somebody doesn't get fired in Philadelphia for police brutality and then resurface in Houston, Texas a week later. And then there are a number of legal doctrines that have grown up, basically judge-made legal doctrines around qualified immunity that make it nearly impossible for people to sue and to get damages against the police or against government generally. So I think that's going to be a very critical step to take. But back on your point about education, Lia, I am of the mind that the reason that we have relapsed so much at every level, from popular culture to the political framework to the Supreme Court, into reactionary ways of thinking, is because we've not moved forward on education in large parts of the country, and our system is so fractured and fragmented there. And so we are going to need a revitalization of education across the country. We're going to need to be fighting for equal funding of schools so that we don't have this property tax-based system of funding our schools that ends up with rich schools and poor schools in so many parts of the country. And of course, those class lines often double as race lines, but not exclusively. And I guess the last thing I would say is that, if there's one thing that our side has got to learn about from the recent American election, it's that the people who are fighting racism and view themselves as anti-racist need to interact with the rest of the population in a way that people don't interpret as condescending and patronizing. And of course, in our society, we have a long history of Puritanism, and there is a way in which the anti-racists get characterized as kind of puritanical language censors who go around and just tell everybody else they're using the wrong pronouns or whatever. And 3/4 of Americans never go to college, so then this anti-political correctness thing, which Donald Trump basically began his first campaign with, also becomes a statement of anti-snobbery or anti-elitism. And unfairly, but that is, because there's nobody's a bigger snob or elitist than Donald Trump. I mean, as several people, including Howard Stern, have said, he would never invite any of the people who come to his rallies to the White House or to Mar-a-Lago. I mean, he has absolute contempt for the people who follow in his train. But it does identify a real issue, which is that, within our side, we have got to watch the tendency to be sanctimonious and to lecture other people, as opposed to what the modern civil rights movement did, which is to go out to the most difficult parts of the country where there's not a lot of education and educate people. And that, of course, is what Bob Moses did in Mississippi with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And it's what Bob Moses is doing today with the algebra project, talking about math as a civil rights issue and needing to go out and to educate lots of people who are not getting a math education so they can be part of the scientific, technological networked world that we're in today. So it's a complicated array of issues, but I think that we're not going to succeed if we don't look carefully at all of those class questions which cut across the lines of the racist, anti-racist divide.
Thank you very much for that, Jamie. Thank you. And as you bring these things together, it makes me think of our panelist, Maria, who has spent this extensive amount of time on both sides of the Atlantic. I see Dr. Pierrette Herzberger-Fofana is signing off. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much.
Exchange. Yes, and bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
We're honored.
And I know we're honored too. Yes.
Thank you. And I understand we're running out of time, but I would love, Maria, if we could get a little discussion from you with this unique perspective. And people often talk about this ideal of European progressiveness, and you have spent time looking at these issues on both sides of the Atlantic. Do you see where might you see the strongest opportunities for cooperation, for progress, those kinds of things?
Yeah, for sure. And it's such a valuable and valid question now more than ever, with everybody, without the internet mongrels who are playing havoc today on us. But typically they're above board and playing nice. But with social media and the rise and the speed of information sharing between one side of the world to the other, when George Floyd was murdered, that just didn't resonate in the United States. It didn't just resonate in one state. It didn't just go from east to west coast. It went from the east to west of the world and back again. There was protests here in Ireland. There was protests right across Europe. There was school kids standing outside their elementary schools in the rural part of Ireland, holding up signs saying all lives are equal. And if we think that the conversation, the education point, and picking up from your last question, didn't happen here, it did. Did it happen to the point where we see instant change? No, but we see a lot of conversation and, unfortunately, visibility. And we might know this being elected officials or in education. Visibility plays a huge role in making change, and I can say this as a newbie to politics. When I come out of the parliament and I pull my hair out, going, but why can't we have instant change? There was this great idea. Why can't we just get funding and get it moving? Often it's social grassroots programs and movements that call for change long before legislation and policy comes in place. And until we find equilibrium between those two, and until we start righting the wrongs in our education programs from America to here, then we are going to continue on with generations and generations of George Floyds, unfortunately. And the list is endless. It's not just with George Floyd, but from our side, we were very quick in the European Parliament to create a resolution that really forced those who are uncomfortable talking about race or xenophobia or homophobia or misogyny, because that's also alive and well, but we are forced to have those conversations. And as for my generation, I welcome them, as difficult as they were to hear, be it the extreme rights and far right viewpoints on what a person's color, skin, or creed is. But those are the conversations we needed to have in the House. And I remember at one point I'd asked in a plenary speech late at night, and no doubt the congressman can add, often the social topics that bear the most fruit, that directly impact the hearts of our citizens, are not on the heavy level, because they're not the trade or the currencies or the big ticket items, but they are monumental change for our community members. And they're the stories, because social change happens with with using human stories. And I just want to say, because I know I'm going around the house on you, Lia, sorry, in answering your question, but from taking a little bit closer to Ireland right now, and across Europe too, right now we have an immense conversation around migration and what asylum seekers are and what value and they bring to the European Union and what value we bring to their lives. And it's a two-way conversation, but ultimately we need to learn why migration happens, why asylum seekers are forced and fleeing, leaving their countries, why racism or homophobia or misogyny even happens at our dinner tables, not just in foreign lands that we see on social media and news headlines. And here in Ireland, we're having conversations around what we call direct provision. And we have an awful lot of work to do on, I guess, bringing it home back to Mother Teresa's famous quote of, you want to change the world, go home and love your family. And ultimately, you know, people feel comfortable saying racist, discriminating words. They don't just lick it off the street. They hear it and they see it online. Algorithms and social media and large multinationals have a lot to answer to. Politicians who feel comfortable in public saying things and in private saying other things. Like we need to look at ourselves long and hard in the mirror and figure out not just this generation or this world we're living in, but where do we want to actually be? And when do we stop writing people out of our history books? Because ultimately, when we feel comfortable doing that, then nothing will change. Again, Lia, I went from this point, I did a politician on it. I went from this point and went around the houses. Sorry.
No, that was absolutely fantastic, Maria. Thank you so much. And it was, I think it's in some ways quite heartening to hear similar principles echoed by members, by representatives that we have here in the United States and in Europe. And this is a very difficult time, you know, and I realize that we didn't have you for very long. I'm so grateful that you all have been able to join us. And I mean, I could close up, but I would sort of like to give time for maybe just one more question, if you both are up for it before we sign off.
You don't have to ask an Irish woman to continue chatting.
Okay, well, that is fantastic. Let's see. So I've tried to weave in some of the questions from the chats. I guess maybe perhaps one might be to talk a bit about, and I'll open it up to either one of you. If you could talk a little bit perhaps about national security, and if you think there is a way in which the current political and civil unrest affects Ireland, affects the United States. And as Jamie mentioned, we have a very different experience here in the United States with prevalence of guns and gun violence. But I wonder if maybe there could be some kind of a positive lesson in terms of addressing these issues as we learn from one another. Oh, Jamie, you're muted. Jamie, you're muted.
And I'm so glad he started talking, because like new politicians, I'm like, I'm gonna let the more experienced
defer.
You'll answer this.
Well, I was just going to say that amazingly, President Trump's Secretary of Homeland Security issued a report about 3 or 4 weeks ago saying that the single biggest security threat to the American people today, terror threat, is white supremacist violence. Now, it took several years to get them to that point to acknowledge it, but it's of course obvious to everybody that this is where the danger is coming from, white supremacist violence in our society, which has been responsible since 9/11 for far more deaths than any other terrorist element, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or anybody. It has been organized violent white supremacy, which now has an international dimension to it and has tentacles in certainly in Germany and France. I'm not sure about Ireland, so that is a real threat to the democracies, along with the transnational political and financial corruption that we're seeing. And again, the Trump presidency is a great embodiment of that trend also, of transnational elites that engage in both domestic and global corruption at the same time. And of course, you know, every autocrat, dictator, kleptocrat, theocrat on earth was rooting for Donald Trump. You know, Putin in Russia, and Orban in Hungary, and Duterte in the Philippines, and Duda in Poland, and Bolsonaro in Brazil, and you know, on and on. So, you know, the resurgent racism and anti-Semitism and authoritarianism and fascist impulses continue to be, I think, a major threat to democracies around the world, which we've got to grapple with at the same time that we deal with a whole new generation of environmental crises led by, you know, climate change, which is the context within which we really have to be discussing everything else. So it feels like racism is this terrible hangover from the last century, which people thought maybe we'd been able to put to rest. You know, Du Bois said it in America, it was the problem of the 20th century was from the color line, but it's not gone in the 21st century. And now we've got all these other problems to deal with at the same time that we've got to wrestle with racism. So in the American context, you know, we can flip that over and just say it's been the movements against racism, from abolitionism through the civil rights movement and its progeny, that give us hope that we can organize to confront all of these crises. But I think that right-wing politics and right-wing government, at least in our social context, have been absolutely discredited by what we've just seen over the last 4 years. And now the burden is on us to show that we can lead the country in another direction.
Thank you. Thank you. Any concluding thoughts, Maria?
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree with Congressman. You know, in many ways, just as you were asking that, Lia, in many ways, you know, I question whether we've become numb to the mass shootings that we see in colleges and in schools and across the country. And then I wonder, are we so numb in the media that we don't report to the extent that needs reporting that this is a serious issue? And again, you go back to laws and legislations and the fact that we had a president who we had since 2016 that is refusing to denounce certain categories in a public manner, which only fuels home violence and home terrorism, but not just in the States, right across the world. And I agree with Congressman, right-wing viewpoints, not centrist politics, but far-right governments are reintroducing generations, or I should say rolling back generations of change. We see it in Hungary with Viktor Orban's government rolling back on rights around LGBTQI communities, particularly our trans. We see it on women's rights in Poland. And what is really fearful for me right now, and again, I say this as a privileged white woman who happens to be gay, that I would be terrified in certain parts of our community across the European Union if I was living in certain areas where there was extremists or right-wing governments, because you don't know how quickly things change. They take a long time to get there, but they can quickly change back within a blink of an eye. And under the banner of COVID-19 now, we're seeing these changes, which is only fueling more us and them, the polarization. You know, here and you asked specifically about security. Here in Europe, we are seeing rises, an increase of threats in like the likes in Paris or Vienna in the last coming weeks. We've seen them in London. We've seen them right across mainland Europe. Some again reported on some others. That's terrifying given the fact of high populated areas and how urban areas are fueling and sprawling, and how do we protect them without having more guns and men and women in uniform standing on the street creating an us and them conversation. You know, and I'm probably not ending for you, Lia, on a more positive note, but when you think of the eyes of a child and they're walking down a busy street in Paris or Vienna, and they're wondering why men in uniform or women in uniform are standing with AK-47s. And then you go home and you look at the news and you see ordinary Joe Soaps and Mary Soaps standing outside the White House, delighted that they're wearing AK-47s and thinking this is normal. And that is not normal. And until we start reshaping conversations again, I keep going back to the home and we as policymakers, and we get more community members involved in politics and legislation and policy change, then the us and them polarization is forever going to continue. And I do want to leave it on one more negative point, sorry, Lia, Congressman, okay. But it is the case of like Brexit happened because of, I believe, racism. I believe it happened because the us and them, the polarization, we don't want anybody who doesn't look like us living in and taking our jobs in the United Kingdom. And the counter argument of let's remain in the European Union wasn't strong enough, or else people thought, well, that's not really a conversation that's happening in my community. Why do I need to get involved? When in actual fact, we need to get involved in as many conversations around destabilizing polarization, because we will see a upswing. As much as we see a downswing right now with Trump, we will see an upswing of right-wing governments and opinions, and they just take headlines, which then feeds into the dinner tables of people around the world. And on that note, I'm sorry for bringing it down. My bottom line is people need to get involved in politics, and we need to see our communities represented, and that is across all, be it gender, creed, or orientation. And I'll leave it there, Lia. Sorry.
Well, I actually would say, Maria, that this has been an incredibly, it's talking about very important, difficult, and challenging issues in both of our countries. But for us to be able to talk with you, with the other member of the European Parliament, Pierrette Herzberger-Fofana, and with Congressman Jamie Raskin, it actually is, there is some hope in what you were saying about what this moment means, because all of you have talked about the reach, the depth, the breadth of exposure around what is the reality of these original sins of colonialism and slavery, of structural racism, of misogyny, of anti-Semitism, of homophobia. And as you mentioned, with COVID-19, it really lays bare and amplifies these existing inequalities. And certainly here in the United States, we know that, 78% of the children who die of COVID are children of color in the United States. So this is all forcing a conversation about what structural racism means, not only in the context of police violence, but in all of the other areas that Pierrette was mentioning about housing and jobs and educational inequality. And yet, I think what you all three mentioned was we are in a moment of reckoning about this. We are in a moment of reckoning where people cannot turn away. And we are in a moment where the opportunity for education is at its greatest point. And I think that is a very hopeful message that all three of you discussed, this importance of speaking across the lines, of the Mother Teresa quote of, go home and love your family. There's a line from a famous Black woman author, Zora Neale Hurston, in her book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And she says there are years that ask questions and there are years that answer. And the hope would be that we are in a point where we have to answer these questions that have plagued our societies for so long. And the incredible hopeful part of having all three of you honor us with your presence today is the important point about how much representation matters and how much it matters to have you and Dr. Herzberger-Fofana as members of the European Parliament, how much for an anti-racist congressional agenda it matters to have our ally Jamie Raskin in there fighting for the Justice and Policing Act and talking about the necessity of a third Reconstruction. Go Jamie, I'm all for it, the third Reconstruction. And the importance of what it means to have that kind of representation, even here in the United States with our first woman vice president, who's also our first Black vice president and first vice president of Indian descent. And so those are hopeful notes, I think, that we can leave with in this discussion. So I thank both of you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedules during this very difficult time to talk to us about these important issues.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Maria.
Oh, great to see you all. Thanks for letting me be involved.
Thank you